So greetings and welcome everyone. I am Mehak Sharma, Research Associate Cuts International, and I welcome everyone to a webinar on thriving in and from transition, importance of skill development in a dynamic labor market. To start with, I would like to seize the chance to give a brief introduction to our panelists. We are fortunate to have experts in the field of economics joining us for this session. Professor Fiona Trigena is a South African economist and a professor at the University of Johannesburg. She holds the Department of Science and Technology, National Research Foundation, South African Research Chair in Industrial Development. She has been a member of the South African Competition Tribunal since 2013 and served on President Cyril Ramaphosa's Presidential Economic Advisory Council. We welcome you, ma'am. As our second panelist, we have Rituparna Chakravarti. She is a co-founder of Team Lease Services Limited, an independent director. Mrs. Chakrabarti is on the board of Team Lease Services Limited, Evolve Technologies and Services Private Limited, and Team Lease RegTech Private Limited. In the past, Mrs. Chakrabarti was president and trustee at the Indian Staffing Federation and accounts manager at Monster.com, India Private Limited. We welcome you, ma'am. As a third panelist, we have Professor Carlos Braga. He is an adjunct professor at Fundação do Cabral. I hope it's the right pronunciation. Working for various programs. Carlos Primo Braga works in the fields of international economics, macroeconomic scenarios, corporate strategy, and international agencies like the World Bank, IMF, WTO, OECD, UN, etc. He holds a doctorate in economics from the University of Alliance at Urbana-Champaign, a master's degree in economics from the University of Sao Paulo, and a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the Aeronautics Institutes of Technology. We welcome you, sir. As a fourth panelist, we have Ambassador Dr. Mohan Kumar. Sir is Dean, Office of International Affairs and Global Initiatives, O.P. Jindal Global University, and Distinguished Fellow Cuts International. He holds an MBA from the Faculty of Management Studies, University of Delhi, and a PhD from Sciences, PO Paris. He is the Dean, the Office of International Affairs and Global Initiative, and Professor of Diplomatic Practice at the School of International Affairs at the O.P. Jindal Global University, Sonipat, India. Mohan Kumar is the Chairman of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS, since June 2018. He has had an outstanding career in the Indian Foreign Service lasting 36 years, culminating in his posting as India's ambassador to France, based in Paris. He is also actively involved in the Climate Change Accord of Paris in 2015. So before we dive into the exciting discussion, just setting out some house announcement today's session. Today's session will be 2 hours long. The panel discussion will be for 1 hour, after which we will have a question and answer session to make the discussion more interactive. Some points to remember. We encourage the members of the panel to keep their cameras on during the session. Also, please keep your microphones on mute unless you're not speaking. This session is being recorded and will be released later on Cuts International's YouTube channel. The link for the same is in the chat box. It is encouraged that the audience members pose their questions to the moderator, indicating relevant speakers in the chat box to make the session more interactive. With this, I now hand over the reins of the session to our moderator, Mr. Pradeep S. Mehta, Secretary General Cuts International, to take this discussion forward. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mahat. Let me join you in welcoming our esteemed panelists and a warm greeting to everybody who is participating in this session, both on this medium as well as through YouTube channel where this is being broadcast. I would also like to express my sincere appreciation to our partners. Fundação Cabral in Brazil, represented by Carlos, and the Development Policy Research Unit in South Africa, who are not represented in this session. But we have come together to jointly propose and champion the project titled Global Compact on Growth and Employment. This is in continuation of the G20 deliberations that we had in India a little while ago. The idea was that since the G20 caravan moves on to Brazil and then South Africa, and the fact is that all three of us are also in part of the formation of IPSA, that it will be a useful project to look at in terms of how the things are molding out in the G20 process and take forward the discussions that we have had so far in India. The final G20 summit or discussion is taking place on 22nd November virtually, and when after which on that day India hands over the baton to Brazil. Now, coming back to the topic, in the realm of employment generation and economic growth, the issue of skill mismatch has emerged as a significant challenge. As economies evolve and industries transform due to technological changes and Industrial Revolution 4, the demand for specific skills often outpaces the supply, which leads to a disconnect between the qualifications of the available workforce and requirements of the job market. This skill mismatch hinders individual career prospects and has broader implications for sustainable economic development. In a recent survey by a staffing firm, around 76% of companies in India are struggling to find skilled workers to fill open positions, highlighting the mismatch between the skills employers need and job candidates possess. This is a survey done by Team Lease, which is represented here by Rituparna. Now, despite having a working age population of over 500 million in India, less than a fraction of them are considered employable. These developments signal a significant need for Indian learners to bridge the critical skills gap to ensure this digital potential does not turn into a lost opportunity. The issue of skill mismatch was also highlighted by the Honorable Prime Minister of India at the G20 summit under India's presidency. This was on the 8th and 9th of September. The Prime Minister particularly advocated for a human-centric growth with a focus on women's empowerment. A World Bank study highlights the potential for GDP growth by effectively utilizing the existing female workforce. I'm confident that by aligning with a vision, India can successfully achieve its mission of a Viksit Bharat, that is a developed India, by the year 2047. However, this issue extends beyond India. Skill mismatch is a global challenge and a part of the project that we are undertaking. To address the future of employment effectively, I strongly advocate for the development of a unified international reference classification for occupations that will streamline data collection processes for international organizations. This will aid in recognizing the shared obstacles encountered in the journey of skill development and devising appropriate solutions and strategies in response. As per the World Bank, in 2021-22, Brazil underwent a significant economic recovery with a growth rate of 5% in 2021, but coming down to 2.9% in 2022, which is attributed to fiscal stimulus, a successful vaccination campaign, favorable commodity markets, and service demand. Despite the positive trends, structural challenges exist, and Brazil's growth lags behind its peer countries, India, China, India, and Turkey. While agriculture gave a boost to food security and reduced rural poverty, productivity in manufacturing and many service sectors remain stagnant. The 2023 poverty outlook is optimistic, but addressing striking inequalities requires accelerated job creation and increased investments in human capital, which again then subsumes skills building as well. When we turn to South Africa, the unemployment rate in the first quarter of 2023 was recorded at 32.9% and is among the highest in the world. South Africa has one of the world's highest youth unemployment rates, despite high demand for skilled labor, because employability remains severely hampered by a persistent vertical skills mismatch. The outbreak of COVID-19, by provoking a massive loss of employment among low-skilled youth, laid bare the slippery nature for more potential dividends. Vertical skills mismatch, where the level of employees' qualifications is not the one required by the job. It has been pointed out as one of the main drawbacks for the high rates of unemployment and the precarity of employment in South Africa. To address this precarious situation, the youth need to be empowered with skills for the evolving economy, aligning efforts with broader capacity building measures, and collaborating with partners for future-ready jobs and technologies supported by public-private partnerships. Additionally, due to the demands of environmental changes, there is a growing need for the cultivation of green and sustainable skills. Education and knowledge are essential in recognizing and enhancing these skills. Trade unions can play a pivotal role in articulating diverse skill enhancement requirements. In conclusion, addressing the skill mismatch requires a collaborative effort across nations throughout the global south to formulate sound policies and cultivate in-house talent aligned with employment needs. The migration of human resources can lead to imbalanced growth, while joint endeavors can yield proficient and competent human resources. Realizing the potential of existing human resources requires a concentrated effort involving all stakeholders. Lastly, I emphasize that inclusive growth is imperative, and only by adopting a human-centric growth can we ensure adequate employment generation. Let me open the discussions with our first panelists for this session and extend an official invitation to Professor Fiona to share her thoughts. Fiona, let me begin asking you with the challenges that I've already spoken about. South Africa faces unique challenges in terms of economic inequality and unemployment. How can skill development policies contribute to more equitable economic growth and job creation? Over to you, Fiona. About 7 to 8 minutes.
Okay. Thanks very much, Pradeep, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to be part of this seminar on this topical issue. I have some slides that I will share. I just wanted to check in terms of the time, because we were asked to speak for 15 minutes. Should I cut it to 7?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll try and be fast.
No, don't be fast. We can't.
Okay. Thank you. So in my short presentation today, I'm going to center it around 3 topics, which I think are related to the theme of this event. Firstly, looking a bit at the 4IR, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the link with employment. And then secondly, connecting the 4IR with issues of productive capabilities and skills development. And then thirdly, looking at, I think, one of the policy issues facing many developing countries who are pursuing the dual goals of, on the one hand, technological upgrading, on the other hand, the need to create employment on a large scale. What kind of mix of sectors and activities to prioritize? So that will be the flow of my presentation. Just very, very briefly, by way of context in terms of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, I'm sure this is familiar to people here. I think although technological change has been ongoing, it's distinguished by the exponential velocity, the wide-ranging scope, and the systemic impact, with changes being both incremental and disruptive, or revolutionary and evolutionary. Coming to the link between 4IR technologies and employment, obviously it's a hotly debated issue, and emerging evidence empirically from different settings around the world, country level, firm level, and so on, I think providing mixed evidence. I think on the one hand, there's likely to be an impact of the 4IR on the overall number of jobs, particularly in developing countries, through both direct and indirect channels. A direct impact through the changing nature of domestic production with technology intensification. I think in most developing countries, including the three countries that are involved here. It's currently at too small a scale to have a major noticeable impact on aggregate employment, but there are, of course, various forecasts around future impact. And in addition to this direct impact, also an indirect impact through the introduction of 4R technologies in other countries. And one aspect of this is the potential reshoring of jobs from developing countries to advanced economies. I think there's some sound interference maybe coming from somebody else's speaker. In terms of, I think perhaps somebody needs to mute. They're also involved displacement effects as well as productivity effects. I think I won't go through the various channels in detail. We can come back to it if of interest. So in addition to the net impact in terms of the number of jobs, there's also impact in terms of the composition of employment. So the mix of jobs by skills level, by sector, and so on, as well as the nature of work. So this is not so much on the number of jobs, but in terms of the organization of the workplace, work processes, the way that technology and labor are combined, potentially wage levels and wage gaps, and so on. So looking at more the developing country context, I think it's clear that there's huge heterogeneity among developing countries. And even looking at the similarities between the three countries involved here, in particular between Brazil and South Africa, there's also a high degree of heterogeneity. So one dimension of this is heterogeneity in prior conditions, in terms of the levels of technological advancement and technology intensity, levels of industrialization, skills, the degree of policy capacity and sophistication in the state, and so on. And this heterogeneity is also reflects in the degree of and the pace of the adoption of 4R technologies or advanced frontier technologies in general, and also their effects. Also within countries, there's a high degree of heterogeneity, spatial, sectoral, and so on. If we consider sector heterogeneity, for example, some of the frontier technologies, such as automation associated with robots, is very uneven. It's mostly concentrated in a few sectors. So, for example, the auto sector. So if we're comparing, let's say, the auto sector with the furniture sector, we find very significant differences across countries in the extent of automation. Similarly, if we think of other frontier technologies. And it's also worth noting that many developing countries, including my own, are still undergoing elements of early industrial revolutions. Clearly, developing countries, even with this heterogeneity, will be differently affected from each other. But I think here I'm trying to draw attention to some of the differences from the advanced economies. In general, developing countries obviously being further from the technological frontier, and with a gap in digital capabilities, generally being less competitive in technology and skills. I mean, perhaps to some extent, countries such as India might be exceptions in relation to the levels of income per capita. But I think it's still true for developing countries as a whole. And so these kinds of gaps can mean that developing countries can be left behind and potentially lose international market shares. Also noting that the types of skills which are disproportionately needed in the kinds of jobs which are either new or which there are growing demand for as associated with the 4R technological changes. Those are so the kinds of skills which are becoming more in demand are the skills which are relatively scarce in most developing countries. And I think this speaks to the skills mismatch that was referred to in Pradeep's opening comments to this panel. Another factor worth considering is that the lower cost of labor in developing countries, which traditionally has been seen as part of the kind of comparative advantage or competitive advantage of developing countries, in a way, reduces the incentive to automate in developing countries. But what we're actually observing in practice, and this was also drawn on some of our field work at firm level where we've gone to interview them and so on, is that some of the automation which is happening where, let's say, jobs are displaced by robots or whatever, is not necessarily cost-driven, but it seems to be driven by other factors. In some cases, firms are part of a global value chain, or they're linked to a multinational corporation, which has particular standards and requirements in terms of quality and so on. And it's those kinds of factors that seem to be predominantly driving automation where it is happening, rather than direct cost cutting per se. And then in terms of reshoring, it's still nascent, but I think there is some evidence of some reshoring of manufacturing jobs to developed economies with automation. So this is an example of how automation in the developed countries might be affecting employment in developing countries. I think at this stage, still at a relatively early stage though. Linking this to issues of productive capabilities and skills. I think here by productive capabilities, I'm referring to both production and technological capabilities, which are closely linked with learning, really important for any opportunities for leapfrogging, as well as more broadly for catching up with advanced economies. And crucial, amongst other things, for withstanding competition from imports, as well as for growing exports. So that's kind of a general take on productive capabilities. Linking this then to technological change and the fourth industrial revolution, productive capabilities are central to success in the 4R context, success of both at the firm level and at the country level, because these productive capabilities are core to the adoption, the use, and even the production of 4IR technologies. This also speaks to the importance of continual learning. So learning that doesn't happen or doesn't stop when somebody leaves school or leaves a technical training college or leaves university. Here we are talking about the various dimensions of learning, learning on the job, learning through doing, formal training, both at the firm level and outside of firms, informal training through tacit sharing of tacit knowledge, and so on. All of these are crucial to the strengthening of productive capabilities. I think what's been observed, excuse me, I have some cough, please bear with me, is that the types of capabilities which firms and countries require for to deal with advanced technologies and the rapid pace of technological change in the current era is both kind of traditional capabilities and new or emerging capabilities. So here I focus a little bit on industry because that's my own specialization. So in terms of industrialization and industrial policy, it's not only about the kind of new digital capabilities, for example. It's a combination of the more traditional industrial capabilities with the more emerging capabilities associated with frontier technologies. So it's crucial for both firms and countries to narrow the gap in digital capabilities. We find that for the adoption of advanced technologies, as well as even more so for the production of these technologies, there are minimum kind of capabilities thresholds and preconditions to break in. Without those, it's very difficult for, almost impossible, for firms or countries to meaningfully break in to these kinds of technologies. So there are key, what we call transversal enablers, skills, digital infrastructure, regulatory framework, and so on, that cuts across different kinds of technologies, different sectors, and so on. Certainly, there are some opportunities for leapfrogging, and I think this is part of the opportunities that are available for developing countries and for late industrializers that don't necessarily need to go through all of the previous stages of development in a kind of linear fashion. where there are advanced technologies available, and obviously there are questions of access to technology and so on that need to be dealt with, but where there are advanced technologies, you don't need to kind of go linearly through all of the previous technologies. So this presents opportunities for leapfrogging and for accelerated catching up. Again, this underscores the importance of skills development, and not only limited to what's being called future skills and digital skills. Yes, this is a particular gap for developing countries, but not only limited to that. I'll then just come to the last part of my presentation, which kind of connects with this, but has a slightly different focus. Many developing countries face these dual goals. On the one hand, an emphasis on technological upgrading, trying to move towards more technology intensity, more advanced technologies, and so on. On the other hand, also facing the imperative of large-scale employment creation, particularly in the context of high unemployment. And as Pradeep also mentioned in his opening remarks, in the case of South Africa, I think the highest rate of unemployment in the world. One of the, or perhaps the central challenge facing our economy and society, even other countries which don't have such extreme levels of unemployment. I think there are very few developing countries which could say that unemployment is not one of the problems that they're trying to address. So linking this, and I think looking at it as well through a bit of an industrial policy lens, since it's something which I work on a lot, many countries face this kind of policy choice between which sectors or which activities to prioritize for support. Obviously, countries can't prioritize everything. So should they support clothing production, or auto production, or pharmaceutical production, and so on? Of course, it's not just one thing to choose, but at the same time, countries are unable to support and prioritize everything. Otherwise, it wouldn't be prioritization. So while there might be many factors going into this choice, one of the difficulties that many countries face in practice in making this choice is how to balance, on the one hand, the imperative of technological upgrading, and on the other hand, that of employment creation. And I don't want to suggest that this is some sort of binary trade-off, particularly when we take into account indirect labor intensity through employment multipliers and so on. It's not an either-or. But at the same time, I think focusing on one or the other does have different implications. It's a lot of text here. I'm not going to go through everything. I think it's widely recognized that sustaining growth and catching up requires some sort of technological upgrading, for the various reasons that I won't go into here verbally, but are listed here. But I think it's well recognized that in order to catch up and in order to sustain high rates of growth over an extended period of time, there has to be innovation, technological change, technological advancement, and so on. And part of that is moving towards more technology-intensive activities, as well as technological upgrading across the board. So keeping pace with rapid technological change, such as those I've mentioned earlier with the fourth industrial revolution, entails continual learning and upgrading. And generally find that whether firms or countries that fail to do so, it becomes more difficult to subsequently catch up. So although it's not a linear process, but generally falling far behind the technological frontier, it's not something which can just be easily reversed in the next period. So for many of these reasons, developing countries often try to focus on some sort of technological upgrading as part of their industrial policy and growth policy in general. But in the cases of high unemployment or extreme unemployment, such as in the case of my own country, South Africa, this sort of general emphasis on technology intensity and technological upgrading needs to be adapted. So where you have extreme unemployment, it's not it's not viable to just say we're only going to focus on high technology sectors and activities, even if it was possible financially and in terms of capabilities and so on. It's not viable from a broader developmental perspective. So in cases of extreme unemployment, there needs to be greater focus and support for more directly labor-intensive absorbing activities than in other middle-income countries. Here, both those are directly labor-intensive and indirectly labor-absorbing. So mass job creation can be seen as important in its own right, and as a source of livelihoods for families, as well as part of a growth strategy. At the same time, I would, I guess, it's part of the policy debates here in South Africa, and as well as more broadly. Why not then focus only on labor-intensive activities? Why even bother with technology and intensive activities? Why not just focus on the most labor-absorbing? And I think again it comes back to sort of balancing the imperatives of growth and catching up, and kind of sustainable employment creation, with addressing that challenge of unemployment in the short to medium term. Generally, any kind of losses of technological capabilities is very difficult to recover from, and then subsequently to catch up. And in my last slide, this suggests that from a policy perspective, and thinking in particular in terms of industrial policy, that actually a mix of of sectors and activities need to be supported. It's not viable to say only this category or only this other category. It needs to be a combination of those which are more higher productivity, more technology intensive, more skills intensive, as well as those which are more strongly labor absorbing. Of course, that doesn't mean prioritizing everything, because then there would be no prioritization. But it does mean having this kind of mix of productive activities in countries' industrial policies. So let me leave it there. Thank you for the opportunity to present. And let me just apologize again, as I've indicated to the organizers. I already had another commitment at this time, so I will be able to stay for a few minutes, but unfortunately I won't be able to stay for the entire event. So apologies for that. Thank you.
Fiona, before I go to the next panelist, may I ask you a question? How do you visualize the AFCFTA as something which offers South Africa better economic opportunities than it has under whatever trading agreements or regional economic agreement that it has, so that it can, help you to create more jobs?
No, thanks for the very pertinent question. I think both for South Africa and for countries across the continent, the AFCFTA, or perhaps let me just say for those in the audience or listening on YouTube who might not be aware, it's the African Continental Free Trade Area. So it's a regional integration across the continent. So I think both for South Africa and for other countries on the continent, it's seen as a potential game changer. As you know, our population across the continent is in a similar order as that of India. Not quite the same, but in a similar range as that of India, but for the entire continent, split into 54 countries. Many of them have domestic markets which are too small to support the kind of economies of scale, of large scale domestic manufacturing and so on. Whereas if we look at it at a regional sense, there are certainly those opportunities. So part of the logic of the AFCFTA is to say, let's not just break down trade barriers between the countries. Let's build up those domestic productive capabilities so that more of what's consumed on the continent is also produced on the continent. Of course, there are many challenges associated with it. One of these is that it's not just about removing trade barriers. There are also non-trade barriers, different standards and so on. Also infrastructural difficulties, because our transport infrastructure is still largely colonially based, and less geared towards trade within the continent. So sometimes even to transport something 1,000 kilometers across borders in the continent can take longer than transporting it to Europe, for example. So I think the point is that it's not enough just to break down the trade barriers. We also need to address infrastructure and so on. and also to look at the distribution of gains across countries to ensure that even the least developed countries on the continent are not just flooded with goods from countries like South Africa, but are also themselves able to expand their production and exports. But thanks for the really pertinent question.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you very much. Let me take this opportunity to introduce to you my new colleague, Kiran Mitobhan. She's from Mauritius, and she joined us in Kutch here in Jaipur to work on many of these issues that we're going to discuss. And therefore, she'll bring in further insight into this issue that I raised. Of course, the fact is that when you're looking at the developmental problems of the global south, and particularly Africa, we require to look at what could be better growth opportunities, and then we can get into job creation and then skills upgradation. One has to follow the other. At the moment, I think the fundamental question, as you have also pointed out, Fiona, is creation of jobs, and then get on to. And of course, there is this demand on countries in order to ensure that skills are matching, and that is what we are going to look at in this project across the three countries. With that, may I now request Carlos? Carlos, I have three questions to you. Let me just briefly introduce Carlos, who was a friend for a long time. He has been with the World Bank for many years, and therefore comes in with a much better worldview than many of us have. Having said that, Carlos, the questions are, what are the main challenges policymakers face in addressing the global disparity between GDP growth and employment in today's dynamic labor market? And the second question is, can you share specific examples of how Brazil has harnessed emerging technologies to boost its labor market, and what lessons can other countries learn from this experience? Finally, the third question that I would like to ask you is, how can research institutions like us collaborate with government and industry to bridge the gap between academic research and practical policy implementation? Over to you, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. I thank CUTS International, the other partners, and Pradeep in particular for the invitation to Fundação Cabral and myself to participate in this event. Well, with these three questions, Pradeep, I'll have to talk for the next 1 hour. So since we have only 15 minutes, I'm going to share a presentation with you where I address some of these questions, but then later during the Q&A, we can go into more detail about what to do, particularly in terms of cooperation among developing countries and the so-called global south. So I'm going to focus on the case of Brazil, and basically I'm going to start with a little bit of history. The Brazilian economy has been through different moments in the last 70 years or so with respect to economic growth. If we look, for instance, the situation between 1950 and 2007, there are 13 success stories of sustained high growth, meaning countries that were able to maintain a rate of growth on average above 7% for more than 20 years. Brazil was one of them between 1950 and 1980. Actually, during this period, Brazil was the second fastest economy in terms of economic growth in the world, behind only Japan. So this is just to put in perspective the fact that to achieve sustained economic growth is not an easy proposition. More recently, particularly in the new millennium, Brazil was favored by a positive terms of trade shock associated with the great demand for commodities from China. And we had around 2010, we reached a rate of growth of 7.5% in that year. Since then, however, the economy has decelerated significantly. You can see here that in the period 2013 to 2019, actually, the average growth has been negative because we had one of the deepest recessions in Brazilian history and consequently very high levels of unemployment in 2015, 2016. The economy has recovered since then, as Pradeep already pointed out, and this year the expectation is to grow something like 3.1%, but also with the perspective of diminishing growth in 2024 because of fiscal imbalances. Actually, the perspective for the world economy as a whole is not very good. I like always to mention John Kenneth Galbraith, the Canadian economist, professor at Harvard, who used to say that economists only make economic forecasting to give credibility to astrology. But in any case, if you look to all international organizations here, I'm using IMF numbers, but the World Bank or OECD numbers are very similar, suggest that the world economy is facing, particularly because of geopolitical shocks and also because of fiscal imbalances around the world, facing a period of deceleration of growth. Now, with respect to Brazil, many of the things that Fiona already said with respect to the fourth industrial revolution also apply to Brazil, and I would argue to most developing countries. But there is a consensus that we need to achieve a trajectory of sustained growth based on macroeconomic stability, improvements in income distribution. Brazil still has one of the worst income distributions in the world, although since 1980s, the situation has improved significantly. So the Gini coefficient, a variable that indicates the level of inequality in the Brazilian economy, was something like 0.63 in 1988. Nowadays is around 0.51. So a significant improvement, but it's still a very unequal society. And of course, sustainability also in terms of the environment. How to achieve these objectives is, of course, open to lots of debate. But there is one area that there is, I would argue, a certain level of consensus, the need to improve labor productivity in Brazil, which is also a challenge for most countries, particularly, as Fiona pointed out, with the impact of digital technologies, new business models, and how we address these challenges. Here you can see how the productivity of labor in Brazil evolved since the 1950s. So from 1950 till 1980, productivity increased on average around 4% per year. And Brazil, it was in a clear track of catching up in terms of income per capita with the industrialized world. Since then, however, productivity has increased below 1% per year. There is one big exception on this. I will talk a little bit more about this later, which is the agribusiness sector, where Brazil has been experiencing growth around 4% per year, actually is one of the champions in terms of increasing productivity in the agricultural sector. Now, the Brazilian labor market, the labor force is around 140 million people. Only 17% of them have a university degree or a vocational degree. Unemployment remains a problem, not as high as in South Africa. It has declined from 14.9 in the beginning of 2021 to something like close to 8% nowadays. But it is a particularly critical problem for the young. Not only that, we have, again, a major problem in terms of the skill qualifications of the workforce. Only 33% of the labor force has completed high school, and the quality of primary and secondary education, although it has improved, remains poor. Fully 70% of young workers that enter the labor market do so via the informal sector and typically remain in formal activities 5 years later. So the main challenge from a labor market perspective in the case of Brazil is how to generate good jobs, how to rapidly improve the qualification of the Brazilian labor force, and how to better align the future demand for qualified labor with the evolving supply of labor in Brazil. And this, of course, is crucial to improve labor productivity in Brazil. Now, if we were going to go into the details, and I don't have time, but why we have had limited growth of labor productivity over the last few decades, the usual suspects are, of course, the educational system, low rate of investment. It has averaged 17% of GDP in the last 10 years. If we compare with India over the same period, it was 32%, with China 44%, and total factor productivity, a proxy for innovation, also has been limited, again, with the exception of the agribusiness sector. And we have also a misallocation, although human capital accumulation has occurred at a significant level over the last few decades. It is true that its impact on income per capita growth has been limited, which hints to the fact that we have significant misallocation because, for instance, of the labor laws in Brazil, which impose significant constraints on mobility of labor, and a tax system that is extremely inefficient. Brazil has one of the most complex tax systems in the world. Right now, we are in the process of a reform of the tax system. It has just been approved yesterday in the Brazilian Senate. It has to go back to the House of Representatives for final adjustments, and we'll see if it's going to make a difference. Labor laws have been reformed in 2017, and this has improved a little bit the environment for labor in Brazil, although there is still a bias for activities in the informal sector, exactly to escape, let's say, the burden of the labor laws and the tax system in the country. So, with respect to the future of the labor market in Brazil, and I'm going to focus on 4 topics that I addressed in the paper that I prepare as a companion to this presentation together with a colleague, John Welch. And the 4 items that I'm going to discuss is basically, first, one very much related to the expansion of opportunities associated with the digital revolution, the so-called gig economy. As you know, both in Brazil and all over the world, the possibility to operate with flexible jobs connect to digital platforms, the examples of Uber, the example in the case of Brazil, delivery of food, like the company iFood in Brazil, this has expanded dramatically. We are in the middle now of a big debate on how to regulate these sectors, particularly with respect to labor laws. it's important to recognize that 48% of delivery workers and 37% of workers that operate as drivers on demand have alternative jobs. So this is the gig economy in most cases offers complementarity to the activities of workers in Brazil. And we are talking a significant number of people operating in these areas. So the big debate now is how to regulate these activities, because if you impose, like some countries, for instance, Belgium, Spain, Switzerland, that basically apply formal labor contracts to these activities, this will be very disruptive. On the other hand, it's recognized that we need to incorporate measures like, for instance, access to life and accident insurance and guarantee for minimum remuneration. But how to do this in the context of Brazilian labor laws is still an open question. The other area is something that Fiona has already discussed in detail, are the implications of the digital economy. There is a recognition that the digital revolution is having significant impact on the labor market. And of course, there is still lots to come, particularly with respect to the future impact of artificial intelligence. And in this context, there is a perspective. The World Economic Forum recently made an evaluation of the number of jobs created by these digital technologies, blockchain, artificial intelligence, robotization, etc. And the outcome is that in reality, there is more jobs that will be displaced than jobs that will be created. Of course, this doesn't imply a negative impact on welfare because, as was pointed out before, it will all depend on how effective these new technologies will be with respect to productivity for the economy at large. But in the case of Brazil, Fundação Dom Cabral did a study that is one of the inputs for the analysis of the World Economic Forum that also shows that we will have a negative impact overall if we don't take into account the positive effect of productivity increase. And all of this comes together with the fact that in Brazil, the annual demand for professionals with information technology background greatly exceeds the supply of professionals in this area. So this is something that requires attention from the government. Now, moving very quickly to the so-called green economy, it's interesting to note that Brazil has one of the cleanest energy matrices in the world in terms of production of energy. More or less 80% of the energy supply in Brazil comes from sustainable source like hydro, biomass, wind, and solar, while in the world as a whole, the average is between 15 to 27%. These are the good news. The bad news is that Brazil is also an important player in terms of emissions of greenhouse gas like CO2. What is unique about Brazil is that our emissions are mainly related to deforestation and to agriculture-related activities, very different from most countries in the world. Looking into the future, if Brazil can control illegal deforestation, promote better land use by continue to improving productivity in agriculture and restoring degraded pastures, it can become a major player with respect to renewable energy and a leading producer of green energy. So just to finalize, the care economy. Brazil is aging in a very rapid pace. It's quite interesting to notice that the fertility rate in the case of Brazil was 6.1 per woman during their fertility period in the 1960s. Nowadays is around 1.7. So the Brazilian population is already entering a phase that we are not able even to replenish the population. We still have a demographic bonus because life expectancy has increased significantly in Brazil. But the reality is that we now have a problem that goes beyond the questions raised by the fiscal impact of a growing dependency rate, particularly with pensioners, but also the implications that this has for productivity. It's true that the aging of the Brazilian society will increase demand for various care sectors, particularly healthcare, elder care. These are also opportunities. But making the elderly more productive is also part of the challenge faced by the public and the private sector at this point in time. In the paper that I produced together with John Welch, we do an analysis of the implications of the demographic change on productivity. And the bad news is that, as we suspected, there is a negative relationship. The more the society ages, the lower tends to be the level of productivity. So this is a critical challenge for the country. So, as I already said, to increase the productivity of labor is critical for the country. We need, of course, to do several reforms with respect to the tax system, with labor laws, etc., to diminish the informality in the economy. And of course, we have to continue to invest in education. In reality, Brazil invests more or less the average that OECD countries invest in education, but the quality of this investment is open to discussions. We have opportunities, significant opportunities in the area of the green economy, and also with respect to food security, another major challenge for the world. Brazil is very well positioned. But how to respond to the challenge and opportunities of the digital revolution remain a critical question at this point in time. So just to conclude, Pradeep, I didn't address exactly your questions, but I'm reminded of a conference that I helped to organize when I was in the World Bank in 2001 or 2002 in Rome, where the keynote speaker was John Major, the former Prime Minister of the UK. And he initiated his presentation telling the story of his visit to Russia and meeting with Boris Yeltsin, then President of Russia. And John Major asked Boris Yeltsin, in one word, what is the situation of the Russian economy? And Boris Yeltsin said, good. John Major was surprised by the answer and asked in 2 words. And Boris Yeltsin answered, not good. Is more or less the summary of the situation in the case of Brazil with respect to the prospects for the labor market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos, for a wonderful presentation. And with that, may I request Dr. Mohan Kumar? The one simple question to you is from a global perspective, with your extensive understanding about global issues. How can international collaboration and policies help in skill development and addressing the skills mismatch? Since you're also associated with academia now, the question which I'd asked Carlos, which he did not respond precisely, and maybe come back in question and answer it, maybe I could ask you in terms of the how do you visualize collaboration between industry academia and the think tank community in order to deal with many of these issues that we are talking about. Over to you, Mohan.
Thank you, Pradeep. Let me begin by thanking you and CUTS International for this opportunity. As it happens, this is also the first time that I'm participating after you made me a distinguished scholar. So I'm particularly grateful for this opportunity. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm hoping I'll still be able to retain the attention of my audience. So if you allow me, I'll speak for about 10 minutes. And I'm glad you asked me the question you did, because that is exactly my agenda, frankly, because I don't think I should try to cover what Fiona and Carlos have done so admirably in terms of providing the economic background to this issue. So let me begin by saying a little bit about India, at least my understanding, and then I want to tell the audience what the Indian Foreign Service, the Indian diplomats are up to in terms of helping this particular issue with regard to India. And that will give you an idea about the international sphere, what we can do as well. So India's problem, as many of you know, is that we have a huge population which is dependent on agriculture, and almost all countries which have developed have somehow managed to remove this population from agriculture and provide jobs in manufacturing. That's been the traditional growth trajectory of Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, and many other countries in the East. China, of course, is a classic example, and so on. I think the reason why India has not been able to do that is also well known. It's because of a lack of manufacturing competitiveness, fact that India has not got onto the global value chains. So these people continue to be stuck in agriculture. That is really the challenge that India faces in terms of providing gainful employment to millions of people. Now, services, IT, green economy, artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing is not going to solve the problem for us, because these 500, 600 million people who are dependent on agriculture have not even gone to college. So the only thing they could have conceivably done would have been to make millions of Nike shoes and travel luggage, garments, and so on. This is something we haven't been able to do. This is, Pradeep, this is not the time or the occasion to get into why we haven't been able to do it. The fact is we haven't. So I go back to one particular issue, which is what you highlighted in terms of education. We have a three-pronged problem when it comes to education. One is obviously access of education to these people. Second, the quality of education. But perhaps the most important is the relevance of education. What do you do with a BA degree from some university somewhere in India? We have 1,000 universities in India. And if you do a BA degree in, let's say, literature, drama, whatever, from a university, what kind of skills does that bestow on you so that you can make yourself meaningful for the industry? So that is the real problem. And I think that is an internal problem, a problem that is internal to India. I think we need to invest much more in education, but more importantly, we need to have an idea where to invest. For example, the entire south of India, every street in the south of India has an engineering college, and parents in the south of India will essentially consider you a loser if you end up doing BA economics or BA social sciences or BA, philosophy and so on. They want every child to be an engineer or a doctor or a chartered accountant. So when I decided I could not do any of these, my father said, well, you are completely useless, so why don't you write the civil services exam? Maybe that'll give you an opportunity. Exact words of my father, by the way. All my siblings went to IIT and migrated to the United States and so on. So this is the situation in the South. But then Narayana Murthy of Infosys says, I don't want these engineers, because he says they're supremely unqualified and I have to spend a lot of money on them, retraining them. So that's the broad problem in India, Pradeep. I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I think the prescription is well known. It's going to take a long time. Your question about the global compact, what can we do in the global arena? I think we're doing a lot, actually. One of the things that the Ministry of External Affairs and Indian diplomats now have made it a point to pursue is a labor mobility and partnership agreement with some of our trading partners, with some of our strategic partners. So we're trying to do it with some Gulf countries. We're also trying to do it with UK, Australia, and the United States, not yet. So what does this labor mobility partnership agreement mean? Essentially, it means two things. One, the country kind of commits to promote legal migration and stop illegal migration. So you have a responsibility if you sign this agreement as the labor sending country that India will not try and promote illegal migration. We make a commitment that all migration from our side to the extent possible will be legal. But the second thing is, which is an important commitment that the country takes, is that if the country receiving the labor ends up getting illegal migrants, then they have to be readmitted to India. This is something we would never do when I was still in the Foreign Service. But now, as per this agreement, it's a commitment. If they can prove that it is an Indian national who's actually migrated to UK, Germany, France, whatever, illegally, then India is committed to receiving back this person. So this is the labor mobility partnership model that we are signing these framework agreements to countries where millions of our citizens go looking for work, basically economic migration. The second thing we've done, particularly in the UK and France, if our students go and do a postgraduate degree, those countries will give you an opportunity to allow the students to stay on for 2 years to work. This was not there earlier, but with France and UK, we've been able to convince them that it doesn't make sense for somebody to come and do a postgraduate, let's say in Sciences Po, which was my alma mater where I did my doctorate. You don't want to go to France and do a master's if after finishing the master's, the country says, please go back. Because one of the reasons why at least Indian students want to go and do their master's is actually also to get some work experience. So that is the second thing we have done in terms of employment for these people. The third important issue we haven't been able to resolve, but is a burning issue between the United States and India, is totalization agreement. And this is something that you know, Pradeep, we've done this in the WTO when I was talking to you in Geneva. But for those who are not so clued in, totalization agreement refers to, let's say, an Indian professional who's working for the Tata Consultancy Group, goes and works, let's say, 5 years in France. He works in, let's say, Lyon, and he's able to execute a project for Tata Consultancy Services, and then he comes back to India. He's a professional, he goes for 5 years, comes back to India. During the 5 years, the French government says that you must contribute heavily to pension and to social sector charges, what they call charge sociale, that is social charges, which are very high in France. The idea being that it makes sense for a French person to do that because he's going to live and die in France. But this Indian is going to get 40% of his salary blocked by the French government. Then he comes back to India. This is not given back to the Indian professional. So a totalization agreement between India and France would settle this problem. And we believe it is extremely important for this to happen so that we can have more professionals going willingly to France and other countries. With the US, the problem is particularly serious, and we are still negotiating that. The other thing which we are trying to do with Australia and UK is mutual recognition of degrees. So if there is somebody who has done a postgraduate degree, a medical degree, an architect's degree in India, that should be mutandis, of course. They need to check the quality and so on. But if that can be recognized in places like Australia, UK, then that facilitates movement of professionals and it improves the employment prospects for a country like India. while at the same time bringing value added to countries like Australia and the UK. The G20 meeting, that'll be my last point, in addition to a couple of small points that I will make, but the G20 declaration, the labor ministers met, and they have made it a point to request the ILO, the International Labour Organization, to come up with an international classification of job occupations on which mutual recognition can proceed. So ILO, if that can come up with an accepted, mutually agreed international classification of labor occupations, that'll be great as well. The issue of visas is a very serious one, because if you are looking at a global pact for growth and employment, there needs to be a recognition on the part of developed countries that visas cannot be used as a protectionist measure to prevent mobility of labor, because that's not done. We are not talking illegal migration. I would pay credit to some countries like Australia, Canada, which actually publish an occupations list every year, making it known to everybody, these are the occupations in which we have a labor shortage, and we welcome labor from abroad. I think that's a very transparent and objective way of doing it. And I have to give credit to these countries for doing it. I think we should encourage other countries also. It's not like India wants to invade many countries with plumbers and nurses and, doctors, those kind of things. But where there is a labor shortage, I think it is in the interest of the receiving country and the sending country to make sure that there is a legal framework for this to happen so that both countries can benefit. Lastly, residency requirements. Many people go to Canada, New Zealand, Australia, US, not US so much, because US now green card takes forever. But if you take a country like Canada, you take a country like Australia, an Indian can be reasonably sure that in 6 to 8 years post-graduation, let's say it goes to, he or she goes to study. After 6 to 8 years, they can be automatically ensured of a residency card, which then after another 6 years entitles them to citizenship. On the other hand, if you take a typical Indian who goes to work in the Gulf countries, when I say Gulf countries, I'm talking about Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, and countries like that. You can actually spend 25 years in those countries and you would still be obliged to go renew your visa every 2 years if you have an Indian passport. You will not be conferred any permanent residency requirement, despite the fact that you worked in those countries for 25 years and you have made a solid contribution to their economy. So these are, I believe, some of the areas where I think India is trying to have some common legal framework which can be applied to all countries so that it improves the prospects for Indian labor. The assumption being, Pradeep, and I'll stop here because I'd rather answer questions than just going on like this. I think the assumption with India is, and this I realized when I was India's ambassador to Bahrain, I made the somewhat heretic statement that I told the Kerala chief secretary that there are only 3 people in the Indian embassy in Bahrain, the ambassador and 2 other diplomats. How the hell do you want me to cope with 400,000 Indians in Bahrain? I simply can't do it. So I told him, why don't you regulate the immigration from Kerala? He kind of just ripped into me and said, you have to stop behaving like this elite IFS officer who doesn't know a damn thing about what's going on in the country. We simply have to provide for immigration of youth from India. So much so the Indian foreign policy now clearly says one of the foreign policy objectives of India is to get H-1B visas, is to provide and encourage immigration from India. Because imagine what would happen if people from Punjab are not able to go to Canada, people from Kerala are not able to go to the Gulf. Literally, the chief secretary said that those states will suffer because they are so dependent on immigration, so dependent on remittances. Finally, just a joke, every time I met the King of Bahrain, he would look at me very seriously and say, Excellency, how are you? And I would say, Your Majesty, thanks to you, I'm doing fine. And then he would ask me, is there anyone left in Kerala? Or are all of them here? So I would say no, there are lots of people still left in Kerala. And so please give us the opportunity of sending more and more people. So I think this is an opposite problem to Carlos. And that's why I wanted to focus on it, Pradeep. And while there is a depopulation problem in Brazil, we have the opposite problem of a population bulge. And this can only be a demographic dividend if you can spend on health and education, if you can provide for legal immigration, and if you can provide a safe, good future for the youth, and somehow get these 500 million people who are dependent on agriculture, move them to other parts of the economy, even if it means some of them will become Zomato delivery executives. But even that is better than just the grinding work that they have to do on agriculture. So once again, Pradeep, thanks very much for the opportunity. Happy to take questions later on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohan. Just two immediate responses. Carlos, like Mohan spoke about Zomato. Zomato is one of our big food delivery companies, which employ a huge number of gig workers. I thought it's important for others to know about it. Secondly, Mohan, the issue about, you're talking about exportability of labor from India. It's a very major marketing push for us. They require adequate and appropriate skills to be able to cope with the demands abroad, rather than just to be as another sort of set of unskilled workers. There are semi-skilled workers in the Gulf which are also required, for the sheer fact that they don't have that kind of population, and their own populations then now become lazy when they find that you can get imported labor doing that menial job. You land at Heathrow Airport, for example, and you find everybody from South Asia, if not mostly Indians, doing all kinds of menial jobs, cleaning and sweeping and doing all that kind of thing. So these things are there. They may not require the kind of skills that we are talking about, but overall, I think the points that you made were excellent, and you didn't need a PowerPoint to communicate with the audience. It was a very good extempore speech. And with that, may I now request Rituparna.
Hi, Pradeep.
Hi, how are you? Could you share some insights into how private enterprises are adapting to the changing labor market and the importance of skill development in this context? And
Yeah.
if you could also segue into what Mohan was speaking about in terms of the exportability of our labor. Indeed, I mean, in terms of labor remittances, we are the highest in the world. I mean, we earn a huge amount, about $80 billion a year or $70 billion a year. Anyway, over to you, Ritu.
Thanks so much. I mean, I think the macro points have been beautifully covered already by Fiona, Carlos, and Mohan. So I'm not going to run through it, but I think just to give an introduction that I'm a little bit more about why I'm also having the courage to speak in a forum like this, which is as knowledgeable as this. I spent the last, a little over last 2 decades working at the intersection of employment, employability, and education in India, and trying to figure out how we can put India to work. And when I say put India to work, in terms of putting India into formal work, work of dignity, work which are well paid. So I'm sure most of you are already aware about the recent debate which took India by storm, right? Where one of our extremely respected leaders essentially alluded that the youth of the country should work for 70 hours a week. And there was a storm after that. I think India was divided on this particular subject. There is a wide section of founders, startups, or founders and CEOs who said that's exactly how it ought to be. And then there's a large section of also established CEOs and youth who believe that otherwise. Amongst the furor, which essentially got the tonality of fairness, hard work, The point which got lost is that that was used as a reflection or as a case or as a path towards making India productive, right? That's the case which essentially, I'm somebody who personally do not have anything against hard work. I've been an entrepreneur all my life and I've worked 16, 17 hours myself. But I'm not too sure that working harder has correlation with improving productivity of a country. And why is it relevant today? Because we're talking about skills, right? And why is skills important? Skills are important because it's the only way by which you can make the workforce of a country more productive, which has its own economic value. Now, India has aspirations, and India is already the 5th largest GDP in the country, and we have aspiration to be, in a short while, probably the top 3. But what does it mean for the workforce in general? The reality is today, India is 142nd in the per capita income equation, which means while we are a large economy and a definitely growing economy, it's not really translating into value or productivity when you equate it with what's happening in terms of per capita income. So what's going on here? I think it's a fact that only 4% of the Indian workforce has had access to any kind of formal training. Of course, the average for males is about 8-9%, and the average for women is about 3%. So that's the India that we are talking about. And sometimes in the debate, like the one that's been happening of late, we lose perspective of the larger population of India. We also lose perspective that 90% of India's workforce is still informal. When you are in the informal sector, it acts as disincentive for both employer as well as individuals towards acquiring new skills. So what it essentially means, the more formal India becomes, especially the workforce, it will definitely create incentives for men, women alike to essentially adopt skills and formal skill sets. So there are many instances right now wherein even if youth are going in for formal education, they view that they are not getting the premium that they should get, right? I mean, in India, we haggle with our electrician who comes to our office or comes to our houses to fix maybe a loose connection somewhere or a fuse here. With that guy, we haggle to pay them 50 rupees or 100 rupees. So even if that guy goes and gets himself a degree, we are not really giving the premium. So that's essentially the reality of India. And then we have corporate India, which essentially is saying that we do need people, we have jobs, but we cannot hire the kids who are right now available. So essentially, I'm making a case that in order to improve India's productivity, we definitely have to take a democratic approach towards creating access towards skills across the length and breadth of the country. It should not be limited to the engineers in Bangalore or Hyderabad or let's say Chennai. It's something, there has to be a well-designed ecosystem which essentially helps in creating the skills. Many initiatives have happened. I think since 2017, the government has been, and maybe a little earlier, has been trying to bring skills into the center of all that's going on. Ministry of Skills got created. A lot of budgets were also doled out. But I don't think there is any evidence of that translating into better skills for us, or there has been any movement on that front. So what do we do? And what's the process that was adopted? That we will look at a large-scale forecasting of skills that will be aggregated, and that information then shall be utilized towards giving incentives to training institutes, NGOs, to produce those skills. And that's essentially what corporate India shall consume. But we all know that there is so much of lag in this process that by the time the information gets collated, and those skills gets disseminated, the relevance of the skill is gone. And that's been a perpetual situation. We live in a world where the demand for skills are extremely dynamic, and hence, what essentially is the way out of this? I think that's why we don't talk about it enough, but we have to, we must, because if we want to become Germany, Japan, we want to become China, I'm not saying become, but beat them in this. We have to also learn from what's happening in these countries. These countries almost, 13-14% of their population actually comes into the workforce from something which is called the apprenticeship program. And some of them are extremely advanced. And I'm actually making a case, and I've been making this case for a very long time, that we need to encourage apprenticeship. The corporate India, the only way out for them is to adopt it. We've stayed away, I know, for the longest time because of many regulatory challenges, disincentives, but a lot of it has been overcome. And more recently, I feel that we have to figure out a way by which we can encourage degree-linked apprenticeship program, which means connect academia with the skilling process which is happening on the job. So if we can create incentives for the youth that come and do apprenticeship after your 10th or 12th pass, rather than going to a regular college, which has very high record of unemployability, come and do an apprenticeship program, and we have the digital infrastructure through which we can actually get them offset some of their on-the-job training credits and get themselves recognized in digital also learning, theoretical learning happening through mobile phones, through accredited universities, which actually allows them parallelly as they gain on the job experience to also get themselves a degree, because degree has social signaling value. In India, you get married because you have a degree, even if you don't get a job. So if you're able to combine the two, that can actually unleash a massification possibility of skills and high quality skills across the length and breadth of the country. India is a large country. Piecemeal solutions won't work. We have to piggyback on the digital tsunami or digitalization tsunami that's happening all across to essentially bridge the gap. And of course, create a widespread awareness in terms of the importance of skills, ensure that there is a premium which essentially gets assigned to skills. And most importantly, I think all of this will work only if there is a clear pathway towards formalization of our workforce. And that's honestly not just a skilling solution. This is essentially the structural problem which has to be solved by ensuring that there are more cities in the country, that the point that Mohan was mentioning, that there are non-farm jobs which are getting created. The average size of enterprise needs to increase and improve so that their ability to create formal jobs are getting enhanced. The regulatory situation needs to get better. It has become better, but it needs to become much more easier to do business in India and hence create more jobs. And most importantly, a practical and a pragmatic view in terms of how academia, skilling institutions can work together. If we do all of this together, I think everyone's going to be happy. The youth will be happy. They will have the desired skills as well as the desired wages. Employers will be happy. They're getting the skills just in time, the quality that they need because of there being an apprenticeship program which is embedded in their own organization. The country will be happy, the GDP will look good, as so will per capita income. I know it's easier said than done. It's not as easy as I'm making it sound. But for the paucity of time, obviously, I won't take more of your time. I'm just triggering the thoughts. In terms of migration of labor, already the world is viewing India as a talent powerhouse. And I think if you're noticing or you're reading what's happening in recent times, while there is a slowdown in IT, the most of the think tanks or the thinking part of most organizations across the world, all research work, everything, they want to move to India. Why? Because in spite of the non-democratic availability of skills, the quality of skills that are still available in this country is very high. So two things is going to happen. The higher order, the highly skilled jobs which are there, or with jobs which do need the intellect that our kids have, will come by way of GCCs and GDCs into India. And of course, you will have situations where the kids who are at the bottom of the pillar will find opportunities with some amount of skill interventions in, whether it's in Europe. I mean, I think there is a standing demand from Europe of different skills from India, whether it's in Japan, whether it's in Middle East, and the likes. I mean, I'm not going to detail it. So India is going to be a powerhouse. But one thing I think we need to be worried about, India has already started. I mean, for the first time, the birth rate per family in India has dropped below 2. So the worry right now is that, is India going to get older before they become richer? So I think this is going to be a big conundrum and problem that we're staring at. Developed countries, they have become richer before they became older. So there is still some segue or pathway for them. But for India, if we are not essentially being quick about this solving the skilling problem and hence the per capita problem, we are staring at a double whammy soon into the future, maybe in the couple of decades. So I don't know whether I answered your question, Pradeep, but just dropped a few thoughts.
That was an excellent presentation, Rituparna. You took us to area that we didn't speak about. Carlos, just to speak about something which Rituparna spoke, Narayan Murthy, who's the sort of founder of Infosys, one of our large technology companies in India, recently made a statement which is a little bit controversial. He said that we should have a 70-hour working week. Now, that is something which both I and Rituparna have been doing ourselves throughout our life. We are both entrepreneurs, and this is something which I believe that if the developing world has to develop, they cannot afford to use the entitlements kind of phenomena that has been downloaded on us by the colonialists. This is what I find tragic. A lot of work we do in Africa, that we find that the desire to work hard is so limited, and rather you're more entitled to. We used to work 6 days a week here. I mean, I work 8 days a week. That like Rituparna does. Now, this is something which we have learned, and that is how we've been successful. Also, I would say. Having said that, the other thing which Rituparna spoke about is something which may not be, I don't know about Brazil or South Africa, but India, in terms of skills, set up a separate ministry at the union level, the Ministry for Skills, and it had a lot of programs, etc. I don't think that the results are as expectedly beneficial as we had envisaged for several reasons. I mean, we have our own problems, but I'll not get into them at this point of time, but except to point out the fact that India did take it up seriously, and as you heard from both Mohan and Ritu, we have a very huge export market for our skilled labor, and therefore it is something which is of our interest with that. Let me open the floor for questions, but Mohan, I just wanted to speak to you about, respond to one of the things which we have seen happening increasingly is rural non-farm economy is growing. So labor is not shifting to manufacturing sector because there are no jobs. Manufacturing is not growing the way we have envisaged for the last 15, 20 years, that it should go from beyond 14% to 25%, but at the moment it has in fact gone down. It's gone down to about 13% of the GDP. So we are looking at rural non-farm jobs as a very big area. This is something with agriculture member of Niti Aayog, Ramesh Chand, has been advocating very strongly that, look, there are a lot of opportunities, let us not ignore them, particularly in the food sector, for example, food processing sector. It's very big, and it's something which we have to look at more seriously rather than be shy that, look, manufacturing jobs are not being created. there are jobs in the agriculture, in the rural economy as well. With that, let me open the floor to questions. Vipul? Vipul?
Yeah, my throat is too bad. I mean, let me pick up your last point that this in India, we are having this massive skill development program designed by our government officials sitting in Delhi primarily. I think that model didn't work and it's not good. Simple reason what Ritu has already spoken about. The demands for skill, the demand function is so dynamic. Whereas we are trying to look at it in a static manner. And that too without knowing what's happening on the ground or what is the on the ground situation. Some numbers, some nice Excel sheet, those kind of things, fine. It's too much of target oriented and that too on the spending side. So we have to go for a new model, which if I may propose, just as a thought, there are bodies in India who have done wonderful work on skill development. Of course, their work is very limited due to various constraints. And the real question is who is going to get access to such opportunities unless we provide that access to our masses, to their children, to develop their skills. We'll keep talking, we'll keep organizing these webinars for the next 50 years. So my suggestion is let there be an initiative not led by government, where we get together and bodies like Carlos, this is all Indian terms, Bharat Sevasram Sangh, Ramakrishna Mission, Sadhguru Foundation, and there are many such bodies. And all of them, by the way, do significant amount of work. Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram, significant work on skill development through vocational training of the youth. And let them have a vocational college in every village, every small town of our country. And in 25 years, you'll see the difference. That's my limited submission. Thank you.
Any other questions? If there are no questions, can I turn to the panelists? Carlos, over to you.
Well, I think that our presentations added different layers of the problems that different countries face. For instance, the question of migration, very important for India. It is a concern in Brazil with respect to migration of qualified workers. We have seen this, but from the macroeconomic point of view, it is still very limited. We don't depend on remittance, for instance, from the point of view of our balance of payments. Now, the presentation by Ritu touched on an issue that I think it's very important, which is the question of vocational training. In Brazil, there is a very sophisticated quote-unquote system, which is a partnership between the public and private sector, which focuses exactly on vocational training. And it does a good work in terms of quality. In terms of quantity, is an open question, is exactly the question of coverage, the question of the ability to provide the type of training that the private sector needs, requires, for instance, equipment in the schools that these initiatives, the so-called S, because are institutions like SESI, SENAI, and others that operate, it's the so-called S system in Brazil. But I fully agree that going forward, more and more attention on vocational training is a necessity. In a country like Brazil, and I guess Mohan mentioned this from the point of view of India, we have a very similar attitude with respect to what is the quote-unquote good life. And typically, this requires a degree in areas like engineering, medicine, and also the legal profession. By the way, Brazil, if I'm not wrong, is the country with the largest number of legal schools in the world. I'm not going to comment on this because I may be sued. But anyway, the basic question here is how to adapt this challenge that all of us mentioned in the context of each country, and how cooperation in the global south can help share experiences that do work. I found quite interesting the observations that Mohan made in terms of his diplomat career and how, let's say, to address the reality of the problems that Indian nationals face, for instance, in some countries in the Gulf, and the capacity to address these problems in terms of the labor force of the diplomatic corps. So these are issues that in many areas replicate themselves. I'm not going to suggest for a moment that our goal, our dream, should be a mimetic vision of the future to try simply to replicate what industrialized countries went through, because the reality is that that road to development, the traditional road from the agricultural sector to the industrial sector as a lever for development, it still exists, but the advantages of this trajectory have changed dramatically. Nowadays, we live much more in a services economy around the world. So how to adapt to this is one of the major challenges. How to increase the productivity in the context of the service sector is one of the main challenges for our economies at this point in time. And just to conclude, it's important to have a vision, but vision without implementation is hallucination. So how governments can really put together plans that can really be implemented and at the same time have fiscal sustainability, I would argue, is a major challenge if we are going to have progress with respect to labor promotion in the global south.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Mehak Sharma has a question which I had spoken about in my opening remarks. Mehak, would you like to raise your question?
Yeah. So my question is to all the panelists that how collaborative efforts of the IPSA countries or maybe G20 in the global south can help ameliorate employment opportunities at large. Do you think there can be a set international reference framework with respect to the developing countries?
Any other questions? Are there any other questions?
I have a question. I don't know how much relevant it would be, but I would still like to ask. It is to Carlos that how excess demand in the market for digital workers poses a challenge for the future of the Brazilian economy. If sir can elaborate a bit more on that.
It's not irrelevant. It's quite a valid question. Devashi, do you have a question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So
Please.
my question is to Ambassador Kumar, sir. Considering the need for international collaboration in tackling the skill mismatch, how can countries adopt a bottom-up approach involving the local communities in the grassroots level to ensure that skill development aligns with specific demand of diverse region and industries on a global scale? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Mohan, over to you.
Thank you, Pradeep. I think that's a good point about international collaboration. I regret to inform you that we are a long way from that. What I noticed in Bahrain is that Indians will compete with Nepalese, and Nepalese will compete with Pakistanis, and Pakistanis will compete with Bangladeshis. So that is the reality, at least as far as Gulf is concerned. So unless a country creates a niche position for itself, for example, in IT, it's clear that Indians are preferred for a variety of reasons. Similarly, if you take the Gulf, it's very, very interesting that Indians are actually preferred over Pakistanis, despite the fact that, you know, Pakistan has excellent relations with the Gulf countries. That is because Indians over time have established a good record of leaving politics aside and just working. I always joke about Keralites. If there are Keralites in the audience, please forgive me. Keralites leave politics when they leave Kerala. So it's only in Kerala that they are intensely political. They're not political at all. And I've noticed that in the Gulf. Because, you know, back home in Kerala, oh my God, you put 3 Keralites in a room, you will get 10 views. But that's not the case when they come to Gulf. But 2 other areas of concern, Pradeep, since I have the floor or I have the mic. One is an anti-immigration sentiment sweeping in the Western world, which I think is something we should be aware of. There are elections coming up in UK. There are elections coming up in the United States. There are elections coming up in other countries in Europe. And it seems to me that immigration is not the flavor of the season. Even though Europe realizes that they need more people, I don't think it's going to be easy for politicians to justify immigration. The second area of concern I have is that, of course, India has a burgeoning population. I agree with Ritu that at some point, India will also start flattening out. It's a matter of great regret for me that I won't be alive to see that, because I would love to see an India which is flattening out in terms of population. But that's going to be 2040, 2050. So that's probably a little too late. So I don't know how that'll pan out. But there is a Swedish political scientist who says the current universal population PIN code is 1114, assuming the population of the world is about 7 billion, approximately. You've got 1 billion in Americas, not United States, but Americas, including Latin America. 1 billion in Europe, 1 billion in Africa, and 4 billion in Asia because of China and India and the rest. He says by 2040, this PIN code will become 1125. So Americas will continue to be 1 billion. Europe will be 1 billion with some difficulty because I see it actually going down. Africa is the real story. The story is not Asia, which goes from 4 billion to 5 billion. That is largely because of India, frankly. But it is Africa, which will go from 1 billion to 2 billion, a doubling of the population in Africa in the next 20 years. This is now almost a given. And if you look at the emigration patterns from Africa to Europe, Europe is extremely concerned, because if governance doesn't improve, if other things don't improve, you've got a whole bunch of people who are happy to risk their life or do whatever to just emigrate. And that will cause a tremendous strain on legal migration systems or frameworks around the world. So labor mobility will become a completely different ballgame. And as it has happened in trade, where we have said we will now trade semiconductors only with countries with whom we can trust, what they call friend shoring. Similarly, you're going to have the same thing when it comes to immigration and immigration. India will be very keen to get on that bandwagon to make sure that we provide opportunities for our people. but there will be blatant discrimination between one kind of immigration and the other kind of immigration. And that is going to be a huge hot potato politically, because there will be accusations of discrimination and the rest of it. So I don't think the future path, Pradeep, is very smooth. The international collaboration will only be to create international legal frameworks, which the ILO will do. Ultimately, these things get done bilaterally. For example, you know that the services agreement of the WTO explicitly leaves out immigration and visa. This is not covered by the GATS agreement. GATS only talks of short-term mobility of professionals. And even that, you and I know how much we have struggled to get something meaningful there. So immigration and visas will always be the sovereign prerogative of a country. Even today, there is no obligation for a government to tell the applicant why you have been denied a visa. You can't go to courts and say, listen, I'd like to know why I have been denied a visa. The international law is, I have a sovereign right to say no to whosoever I like without giving a reason. So I think some pitfalls lie ahead. But I just want to say that this seminar is extremely useful for India. I mean, there is one thing we haven't been able to address, not because we don't want to answer your question, Pradeep, because frankly, the answer is difficult. You kept asking me and Carlos that, listen, what is it that the industry, academia, think tank can do together, right? You asked that question, you posed that question. I'm hard put to give you an answer, because our biggest problem, I'm going to apologize in advance to Ritu, because the private sector has to, I'm afraid, and of course, people can disagree with me, but the private sector has to do a much better job of skill planning with regard to the country. They have to tell the government, the academia, the institutions, think tanks that, listen, this is our demand for this category of labor, this category of professionals for the next 20, 25 years. I haven't seen anything to that effect. We need a proper plan from the Indian private sector outlining the skills shortage, the skills gap, as you said in the beginning. These things have to be done by the private sector. I don't expect the Ministry of Skill Development to do that. It's the private sector that has to tell the government and people like you and me that, listen, this is the shortage that India faces. Then I think the academic institutions can get into the act and say, for example, if India says we have a shortage of 1 million green jobs, then at least the Jindal School of Sustainability and Environmental Studies can try and say, okay, let's attract more students for this course. Let's try and see if we can train people, in this regard. But if we don't even have a starting point, then I think we are whistling in the dark. That's my sentiment. I'm sorry to end on this somewhat pessimistic note.
Let me give you a quick response to a point which you made now, as well as you spoke earlier. Now, what we have seen in our own research that we have done so far in the area of trade and employment is to see that there are many countries, as you pointed out, Canada and Australia, at least we list out, the kind of shortage of skilled workers. Similarly, there are many others who have been raising, we have done sort of a collation of demands raised by industries and by other occupations for the shortage of skilled labor that they had. Now, what we have been saying, and we've not built up this narrative in spite of, Mohan, when you were in Geneva, and we've been working in Geneva on the WTO for a long time, is to start to build up a good, strong narrative on trade visas, so that we get out of the immigration conundrum totally. I mean, I understand that, yeah, it's a sensitive issue. So the narrative which had to be built up has not been done very cleverly by us and as well as by others. An effort was made by Ministry of Commerce, but that they withdrew, if you remember, the services facilitation. And that was a very, very bad effort made by the government of India. And then it fell flat on its face and then came back. But we need to build up this narrative that, look, we are not looking at visas for immigration, we're looking at visas for mobility of short-term labor, and that they come back and that they get their social security benefits refunded, which again is a major issue. In US, we have something like $6 billion held up of our labor there. Carlos, over to you.
Yeah, no, very quickly, while Mohan was speaking, I was reminded of the story of Danny Kaye, the American comedian, that at the end of his career, he was made honorary UN ambassador. And he went to a conference that before him, the Indian ambassador gave a wonderful speech. So when it was his time to speak, he just came to the podium and said, I wrote that speech. So I fully agree with what Mohan said. It's not going to be governments that are going to solve these problems. They are, of course, they need to be part of the solution in terms of the business environment, labor laws, but the private sector has an important role to play. And here to the question that was posed specifically to me with respect to information technology and the fact that we have an excess demand in Brazil, the issue is that Brazil, from the point of view of the private sector, there is a huge demand for skilled workers in the area of information technology. You may not be aware of this, but in terms of innovation indices, Brazil is by far, particularly with respect to fintech, the top country in Latin America. Now, at the same time, we have this excess demand in terms of the number and the quality of people that have the skills in information technology. And just to give you one number, Brazil, although in the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, we had significant flows of immigrants, we remain nowadays a very closed economy. Less than 1% of our labor force in the formal market is associated with migrants. So this is really a very dramatic situation in terms of market access. And I would argue that one of the measures that government can do in the case of Brazil, particularly with respect to IT skills, is to make it easier for migrants, qualified migrants, to come to the country and to work in this area. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Vipul has raised his hand and we're about to close our event. One thing which we did not speak about when Fiona was here, anyway, Kiran could take that as an African, is Africa more or less is on the same longitude as Europe is. And it is also an Anglophone country. Most of the countries are Anglophone. I just cannot understand as to how they cannot do BPO there. Of course, the telecom infrastructure has to be modernized and upgraded and so on. What we were able to do in India, our BPO business process outsourcing is works out very well. It's also exporting skills across, but intangibly and not tangibly. Therefore, there are a lot of opportunities where we require to build up skills at the same time, have infrastructure to be able to utilize those skills. Vipul.
Thank you. Very quickly on your example on India's proposal on services trade facilitation in the WTO. See, the larger point is, I'm sure Pradeep, Carlos, and Ambassador Kumar, you know it very well, since you have worked so much in Geneva on the trenches. You have to create an environment, right? In Geneva, not here and there. In some other places also, but first in Geneva. Here, what India did, somebody did a paper, or whatever you call it, proposal, cut and paste job, organized a meeting in New Delhi. I was present. Bernard Hoekman was also present, among others. And they thought that the high ones, they thought that we're going to take this proposal to Geneva, and everybody start singing and dancing, put ourselves on their shoulders and say, oh, what a great job that you guys done. So let's take it forward. That doesn't work. It will never work. You have to create an environment, what we call mahol, right? And that is to be done in Geneva, in other few capitals. We submitted a proposal to Department of Commerce. They didn't, I mean, I can't say whether they liked it or not, but they didn't take it forward. As simple as that. So that's a lesson for all of us, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Kiran.
Thank you, Pradeep. So I must say that I'm thrilled to have had the opportunity to partake in that thoughtful discussion regarding this subject. What has been discussed for me, and I'm sure all other participants would join me in saying that, is with the expertise and knowledge of our panelists, there are a lot to think about, right? Everything was eye-opening. Whatever Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Rituparna put forward, I think is thought-provoking. Carlos and Fiona spoke about the challenges that their respective countries face. And I think this is something which I must say is common to many countries, especially the African continent. But what has transpired today is that human capital is under intense pressure worldwide as powerful forces, globalization, demographic and regional shift, the digitization, urbanization, and virtual and informal forms of employment is gaining momentum. But these forces are changing how, where, and when people work, but we continue to base ourselves on human capital development on a mid-20th century model, which is standardized education, which is a one job for life. In today's world, which demands continuous growth and competition, I don't think this model can work, right? We have ongoing technological change, market transformation, and all this require flexible thinking, quick and continuous learning, and as Ambassador Mohan Kumar put forward, mobility. Well, instead of mass standardization, I think now we need to embrace like mass uniqueness and human centricity. We have to keep in mind that human capital is not homogeneous commodity. We have now baby boomers, because I'm having my son in mind when I'm saying this. We have baby boomers who were born during the dawn of the space age, Generation X's who rode the wave of personal computing, millennials who grew up with mobile phones, the Generation Zers who are digital natives. Each group has distinctive interests, values, knowledge, skills, experiences, and ambitions. To participate in society and the economy, they need training, jobs, career paths, new ways of developing their professional lives, and above all, retirement plans. Our biggest problem today is that government are not paying heed to the demand of the private sector, nor to the aspiration of this new generation. Our education and skill development system is continuing to prepare competencies which are outdated or in oversupply by the time they graduate, which some authors have termed it as qualification props. Employers are struggling to hire the talent they require, so force them to take people whose skills and experience fall short of what's needed. Employers will have to spend more money on retraining, and meanwhile, those skills which are not in demand will just take any job simply to earn a living. So the future of our economic demands a new approach. And to realize that full potential of human capital and to fix the global skill mismatch, I think we have numerous challenges to address. We are insufficiently, as everyone has said, focused on training for jobs that are yet to appear, because there are many jobs that are yet to appear, and we have probably not given a thought about this. Skills are becoming obsolete at an increasing fast rate, and no reskilling and continuous training is being envisaged. Access to the labor market is limited. About 41% of job seekers find jobs through online platforms, 40% through social network. Meanwhile, 3 billion people, mostly in Asia and more specifically in Africa, lack access to internet. And then the values and needs of the labor force are shifting. Like we said, the generation Z is ready to accept 10% lower earnings to work fewer hours. So we spoke earlier of 70 hours work in India versus what Mauritius is now envisaging is a 4 days a week. So the future of economy now demands a human-centric approach. And this approach must be used to help workers acquire fundamental skill sets and create an enabling environment for lifelong employability, self-realization, and skills liquidity in a labor market that offers opportunities that is inclusive and focused on people. Being from Mauritius, maybe I would touch quickly on our own example. We have become a successful financial services center over a short span of time. Like we moved from agriculture, then to manufacturing, and then after that to financial services, and like Pradeep was saying, back office operation, like BPOs. We are, I must consider a successful BPO center as well. But catching up with the demand of this sector were quite challenging even for Mauritius. We soon realized that there is a demand for a specific expertise, and a national strategy was built around this. We had a trained force, and I'm using the word had a trained force because now we have other issues, other challenges which are facing us. That trained force now cannot match the new demand, like new emerging sectors in the Mauritian economy. Fintech is now the new in thing. We are not prepared to that. Though our legislative framework is keeping pace, we have innovative regulatory framework, but our labor force is still lagging behind. We have an overeducated population, but not with the right skills. The polytechnics is where vocational training is given, but that polytechnic attract only underperformers, while the elite would opt for university studies without a proper career guidance. Another big challenge which we are facing now is brain drain. So brain drain of those professionals who have received the necessary training are being now coached by companies in Australia, in Canada, and mostly in Luxembourg. So Luxembourg has positioned itself as a financial center with UK exiting the European Union, like with the Brexit, Luxembourg is positioning itself. And now if you walk in Luxembourg, most of the people working in the financial center is from Mauritius. So with the brain drain, we are also facing this issue of aging population, which is going to become quite a challenge from Mauritius. So similar to Mauritius, I think every other country which are in similar situation would need to devise a proper strategy in consultation with private sector, in consultation with the academia, government, all these to address this issue of a mismatch and brain drain. PM Modi at the G20 spoke of a human-centric approach. I think maybe we didn't speak of that. Maybe I'll touch quickly on that. Well, that human-centric approach demands that employees should consciously and independently determine which skills they will learn. Now I'm shifting the burden from employers to employee. So they will have to learn which skill is needed. They will have to define their scope of knowledge. Thank you very much for your outstanding contribution to our understanding of this critical topic. I'm sure that this webinar is going to have a lasting impact on the attendees, just as it had on me. It has on me, I must say. And I hope that this lesson will be beneficial for designing future policy discourse. So thank you very much to all participants as well. And I wish you a great evening. So I guess for everyone who is on this panel now, it's evening. So thank you so much and good evening to all.
I don't know whether it is evening for Carlos, it is day.
Carlos, I'm so sorry. So yeah, you're in the southern hemisphere.
What time is it, Carlos, now?
10:15 in the morning.
Fine.
So
have a good day.
Have a good day ahead of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.